So thank you very much, Judith, and I started the new PowerPoint. And welcome Dr. Naama Jager. She's a lecturer in the Department of Jewish History and Research and a research fellow in the Department of Jewish Literature at Bar Ilan University. Her research focuses on the emergence of the Jewish reform movement in Germany, the evolution of modern European Jewish denominations, the Haskalah movement in the early 19th century, and comparative studies of European and Hebrew literature in Germany and Eastern Europe during the late 19th century. And her lecture today raises the question, who is a Freeborn, an Eastern European perspective on Germany's Jewish women's movement.
So, shalom and good afternoon. Thank you for the introduction. So in the previous two lectures, we heard about the press and literature in Germany. We will now move back several decades to the early 20th century and eastwards from Germany to Austrian Galicia and the Russian Empire. Modernization is a story of tension and conflict. Jewish modernization refers to the lives of Jews whose identity was shaped by the tension between continuity and change, tradition and innovation. This process created hopes and visions for the future among Jews, but it also sparked anxiety and defensiveness. Changes in the lives of Jewish women in the modern era, the image of women among modern men, and the attitudes of modern movements toward women all play an important part in the story of Jewish modernization. Although our conference focuses on Jewish women in Germany, it is important to address broader contexts, including the realities in other Jewish communities, such as those in Eastern Europe and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A wider perspective can provide different pictures on these processes and clarify their impact in broader cultural fields. We should bear in mind that in demographic terms, German Jewry was smaller than the Eastern European communities. At the end of the 19th century, over 5 million Jews lived in the Russian Empire, including Poland. This was the largest Jewish diaspora in modern times. Meanwhile, the Jewish population of Imperial Germany was only some 600,000. Despite their much smaller number, historians of European Jewry in the modern era agree that Germany exerted an extremely strong influence on the Jews of Poland and Russia, as the latter underwent processes of modernization. Political and ideological changes that began in the German-speaking area made their way to the East directly and indirectly. The bonds that developed between German Jews and the Jews in Eastern Europe were an important source of the changes that occurred to the east of the Oder River. This afternoon, I will focus on one particular example of the close ties that developed between East and West. I refer to the Frauenfrage, the woman question, the question of women's rights in general, and to the Jüdische Frauenbund in particular. I will examine this subject as it was reflected in the Hebrew language press in Eastern Europe and Galicia. Thus, my study includes not only the Russian Empire, but also other areas to the east of Germany that were influenced by the emergence of the woman question. The coverage by the press on the establishment of the JFB raised broader questions about the status of women and the status of Jews in Eastern Europe. The extensive Hebrew press is areas encouraged the flow of news and information from west to east. However, along the way, the focus of interest shifted and was adapted to meet the concerns of East European Jews. I should probably begin with a few words about the press in Eastern Europe, since my lecture is based on a selection of articles from this field. A series of domestic political changes occurred in the Russian Empire during the second half of the 19th century. One of the results of the reform era of Alexander II was a reduction of the severity of censorship. This led to the flourishing of the press in general, including the rapid growth of Jewish newspapers in Russian, Polish, Hebrew, and Yiddish. The emergence of the new Jewish press in the 19th century was a key sign of the impact of modernization. Many people at the time agreed that, as the historian Israel Bartal put it, the press is the chief tool of society. So the press was regarded as a modern platform permitting the spread of the values of enlightenment and a central tool of expressions for Jewish intellectual circles. From 1850, the number of Jewish newspapers in Russian Empire grew rapidly. Newspapers circulated widely and became very popular. In Galicia, too, the press served as a medium for international and intercommunal communication. Until the middle of the 19th century, if not later, Hebrew held a central status in Jewish culture in Eastern Europe. And accordingly, I think that the Hebrew press provides a suitable basis for our discussion. As Shmuel Feiner, Tova Cohen, and other scholars have shown, the first sporadic expressions of feminism in the Jewish public domain in Eastern Europe appeared in the 1870s. These early comments were made by Maskilim, the Jewish intellectuals from the Haskalah movement, in Hebrew. They wrote in Hebrew, presumably under the influence of feminist statements that began to appear in Russia at the time. In the early stages, both Russian and Hebrew feminism concentrated on the demand to allow women to acquire a vocation. In the 1870s, several short articles about the woman question appeared in Hebrew press in Eastern Europe. In 1872, Hamelitz, a Hebrew newspaper based in St. Petersburg, published a series of articles by different authors who responded to each other's positions. The anonymous author of one of these articles, entitled Fully Free How? Ben Chorin Gamur Keitzad, wrote, "It is only a dream, as sought by today's reformers, to set a woman free and teach her any craft or act. It would be a joke if a husband agreed to exchange his actions for hers." So the author later abandoned the subject of women and offered some general principles on human liberty, relating to the liberty of men rather than women. Thus, the women question served only as a scornful introduction from which the author turned to the truly important matter, the liberty of men, in the social and cultural contexts. In a response written by the well-known maskil Moshe Moses Leib Lillenblum, and entitled "Who is a Freeborn?" You can see it upstairs, Mihu Ben Chorin. The author addressed the woman question more clearly, and he wrote, "If in the name of liberty I also demand the liberty of control over my fellows, then what I get is not liberty, but power, the destruction of liberty. This denied liberty is one of the foundations of the so-called woman question. Those who explore and comment on this question and solve it in the spirit of liberalism do not intend to free women and exempt them from their obligations to their husbands and sons." So I'm reading from the second sentence. "Let every woman be capable of making a livelihood for herself through whatever skill or craft." So like the texts written by men, writing by women in this period also focused mainly on women's education and the exclusion of women from Hebrew culture. Let's take two quick examples. So the first example is from the article "The Woman Question," A Woman Question, She'elat Nashim, written by Toiva Segal. She was a young woman from Vilna. And the article appeared in the Galician journal Jewry and suggested that vocational training was a first step toward equality for women. And here's another example, an article by Nechama Feinstein from Brisk. The article was published in Hamelitz from St. Petersburg in 1889 and again discussed the issue of girls' education. As these examples show, the discussion of the woman question that developed after the 1870s in the Hebrew press in Eastern Europe concentrated on the themes of education and vocational training. Men and women who advocated the advancement of women stuck firmly to bourgeois family values. It is difficult to find any clear and direct discussion of the woman question during this period in the context of political and civil rights for women. I would like to suggest here that the activities of women's movement in Western Europe in general, and in particular the developments in Germany following the formation of the JFB, led to changes in public discourse on the woman question in the Hebrew press to the east of Germany. I argue that the struggle for women's emancipation in Germany, which was part of the platform of the JFB, turned into a broader and more principled question among Eastern European Jews regarding the rights of Jewish men. From this perspective, the woman question was not just about women, but formed the basis for discourse on the modern Jewish question in Eastern Europe. It is reasonable to assume that the similar women's movements that emerged in Eastern Europe and the discussion of these issues in broader society influenced internal Jewish discourse. However, as the sources show, the influence of the perspective that came from Germany was particularly important. As we know, women's movements flourished in Germany in the late 19th century following a global awakening of feminist sentiments. During this period, women's movements also began to discuss the participation of women in political life and their civil rights. As has already been mentioned during this conference, the JFB was established in June 1904 at a gathering in Berlin initiated by Berta Pappenheim and her partners. The JFB was active in the fields of welfare and social conditions, but also in women's rights and their civil status. As will become clear, the JFB's influence outside Germany was particularly notable in the political context of civil rights. So in the second half of 1804, reports and articles about the JFB appeared regularly in leading Hebrew newspapers in Russia and Galicia. At the time of the founding of the JFB, most of the references took the form of reports on the Berlin Conference. So, for example, here is a report from Hamitzpe, a newspaper based in Krakow. The writer explains that a gathering of women from all countries was held recently in Berlin to discuss ways to secure voting rights and political participation. This example comes from Hatzofe, based in Warsaw, and discusses the goals of the Jewish Women's Association in Germany. The establishment of the JFB even reported in Machzikei Hadat, which was based in Lemberg or Lviv, and was the mouthpiece of Orthodox Jews in Galicia. The newspaper explained, Berlin, an international assembly of women was held here. Its goal is to make the rights of women equal to those of many in every field. So at this stage, close to the date of the gathering, the reports were mainly factual. However, articles soon began to appear, making an ideological and polemical contribution to the discourse. One example of this was a report in Hador, published in Krakow. A gathering of women from all the cultured countries and lands was recently held in Berlin, attended by representatives of various associations. The participants examined and discussed an important aspect of women's liberation, namely expanding their electoral rights. The women aspired to full liberation, naturally including civil and political rights. So the writer supported granting rights to women, and he anticipated that this step would also influence Jews outside Germany. So the woman question in the West world encouraged discussion of equality between all people, including Jews. Thus, the writer's support for women's merchandise in Germany was connected to his hope for the emancipation of the Jews living to the east of Germany. As we will see, this connection was repeated in various contexts and degrees. Hatzofe, which, as I mentioned, was published in Warsaw, published an article on June 1904, in which Shimon Bernfeld clearly connected the woman question with the Jewish question, as it is also clear from the title of the article, She'elat HaNashim, She'elat HaYehudim. So, women's liberation will naturally cause an enormous change in the economic life of the civilized peoples. I like to look at this vision in terms of the Jewish connection to the question. So, Bernfeld went on to discuss the legal status of the Jews. He claimed that even in areas where Jews were fully emancipated, such as Germany, they continued to be an alien body within a modern society that has not yet accepted this alien body. Accordingly, we should also consider the woman question from the perspective of the Jewish question. So Bernfeld was disturbed by the impact of the women's movement in Germany on Jews as a whole if it secured its goals. He anticipated that the impact would be similar to that of the emancipation of German Jews. So he wrote, in general, bourgeois society complains that the Jews enter the country and steal its livelihood, particularly in the most important sectors. Now the same thing will happen when the woman question is resolved. It is clear to me that recent success of the women's movement in Germany will sooner or later increase the prominence of the Jewish question. This will encourage anti-Semitism, as people will feel the competition they face from women, most of whom will be Jews. So, Bernfeld was a native of Galicia, a well-known writer at the time, and a rabbi, was also a historian and a biblical scholar. He opposed that the JFB and the struggle for women's emancipation. As we heard, he was concerned that the emancipation of women would create opposition among bourgeois citizens for economic reasons, as he happened as the result of the economic integration of Jews in society following their emancipation. This would inevitably lead to a rise in anti-Semitism due to the prominent involvement of Jewish women in the feminist movements. On this last point, Bernfeld was correct. As we know, the involvement of Jewish women in the women's organizations in Germany was remarkable and far higher than their weight in the population as a whole. Was Bernfeld right to fear an increase in anti-Semitism, or did he use this as a pretext for his general opposition to women's emancipations? Either way, he clearly felt that the success of the women's movement in Germany would influence the fate of Jews in the East. So we can see that the establishment of the JFB encouraged discussion of broader and more principled questions that the narrow issue of German Jewish women. The woman question was often perceived as one of the questions regarding the emancipation of modern Jewish society, but it was also regarded as a basic question in modern society as a whole. In August 1904, an anonymous writer made the following comment in an article in the Warsaw-based newspaper Hatzfira. The emancipation of women, equal rights, is a question of an enormous public full of wisdom and foolishness. In Europe alone, it concerns not only 170 million women, but also 160 million men. Women believe that equal rights will make them more successful. Men wonder whatever it may cause problems and worries. But that is not all. Above the debate between men and women, we have the affairs of human society as a whole. So this article argued that the question of equal rights for women raised questions not just for the Jews, but for all humanity, as a universal issue that would affect men and women alike. The article does not mention the JFB, but I believe that the over-discussion of women's emancipation is connected to the establishment of this organization. In the spring and summer of 1904, a clear increase can be seen in the number of articles on the civil status of women, suggesting a transmission of information and ideas again from west to east. Later in the same article, the writer declares, if it were up to me, I would remove the barriers. Let every person, man or woman, be free to determine their own actions. Let us finally grant women all their rights. Thus far regarding the question among the nations of the world. And as for us, the grandsons and granddaughters of Abraham, do we raise the woman question? I have not heard of a Rebbetzin who wishes to be a rabbi. As long as women do not participate in the national movements, we cannot hope for any real change. The question is a universal one, not a specifically Jewish one. So the writer supports granting women all the rights and argues that the issue is both universal and national in character. So to recap, for Bernfeld, who opposed the emancipation of women, the woman question became the Jewish question, and he was concerned at the impact of the women's movements on Jews. For the last writer, who supported women's rights, the woman question became a universal and not specifically Jewish question. A few months later, in October 1904, another article appeared in Hatzfira on the subject of the woman question in Western Europe. שאלת הנשים במערב אירופה. The writer observed, one of the most important questions at present is the woman question in Western Europe. This question is soaring in public life in our cultural era and growing daily. It is now a voice that almost everyone addresses, whether positive or negative. So the writer claims that the woman question has become a fundamental issue in Western Europe. However, he continues, this is not the case among the Jews in Russia. The new economic conditions have not yet developed. At present, it is almost impossible to discuss the woman question on the Jewish street in Russia, since the traditional Hebrew family still stands firm. The Hebrew family has not been destroyed to the degree it has among our neighbors, meaning the Jews in Western Europe. So for this writer, then, the woman question that preoccupied people in Western Europe, including the Jews, is completely irrelevant to the Jews in Russia, where women's emancipation is not even under discussion. The article highlights the different reality in terms of family life and tradition in Russia, claiming that this prevents any discussion of the subject. A decade later, we find articles in the Hebrew press in Eastern Europe discussing the suffragists in England, France, and Germany. By this time, the reports generally included sharp criticism of these women. One article, for example, claimed that the women, quote, use any means proper and improper to make themselves sin, end of quote. So by the 1920s, there were few, if any, references to the JFB's activities in Germany. We may now jump forward to the finishing line of the woman question in Germany and the Jewish question in Russian Empire. So, as we know, in November 1917, following the Bolshevik Revolution, the Jews of Russia, men and women, were granted equal rights. A year later, in November 1918, the Weimar Republic was established, and German women, including Jewish women, were enfranchised. But as historians, however, our interest centers not only the final outcome, but also on the preceding changes in public discourse. I will end my presentation with some thoughts on these aspects. So my study was based on sources from the Hebrew press in Russia and Galicia, and assumed that this press was very popular among European Jews and played an important role in their modernization. We can draw several conclusions from the study. Firstly, the establishment of the JFB in Berlin in 1904 attracted strong interest in Jewish society in Eastern Europe. As we saw, the press of the time devoted news reports to the event in Berlin and to the JFB's activities. These reports formed part of the current affairs picture presented the Jews living to the east of Germany. Secondly, the question of women's rights encouraged both conservative and liberal circles to consolidate their worldview. The establishment of the JFB and the reports on the subject heightened the need to formulate clear positions for and against civil rights for women. This had not been necessarily in previous decades when writers discussed the place of women in modern society. And lastly, the woman question in general and the JFB in particular provided some East European Jews with a starting point for the discussion of broader issues relevant to their own reality. In some cases, this meant the question of men's freedom, but in the cases I find most interesting are those that opened up discussion of the emancipation of Jews in general in Eastern Europe. Thus, discussion by the press of the woman question, encouraged by the establishment of the JFB, influenced the discussion of the Jewish question. In the newspapers, the struggle of Jewish women in Germany for civil rights became a metaphor for the emancipation of East European Jewry. The diverse views I have presented here from Eastern Europe regarding the women's movement in Germany highlight the historical importance of the JFB. This organization was influential beyond Germany, including on questions of concern to Jews concerning their place in European society at the turn of the 20th century. Thank you very much.